think we might as well start since there's a delay anyway.
There is a good 20 seconds, isn't it? Cool. Okay, so hello everybody. Thanks for joining. Show and tell number 12. So another live streamed show and tell from people's homes. I have small children in the background somewhere who might make an entrance at any time, so apologies in advance if it suddenly gets a little bit noisy. So this one, we're breaking the kind of cardinal rule of show and tells in that we're probably not going to be showing any actual software today. We're mostly going to be telling you about some of the stuff we've been doing and some of the things we've got in our minds at the moment. So apologies about that. I think we mostly showed stuff last time, so we're not feeling too bad, but we'll try and make up for it at the next show and tell. For those of you who have not been to one of these before, this is our chance to have a bit of a two-way conversation about the work we're doing. So we can share some of our progress, tell you about the things we're thinking about and planning to do, and also give you an opportunity to feedback as well. Now, we haven't got a kind of live Q&A type thing set up for this, so if there is anything that jumps to mind or you want to ask questions about, you can get in touch with us via kind of local Gov Digital Slack, or you can drop me an email and we can have a chat about it afterwards. So we have been taking a mostly agile and user-centered approach. I think we reflected last time that a few things have made this quite hard for us. So having a big fixed immovable deadline in becoming a unitary council, plus the coronavirus crisis has meant we've had to move into some slightly different ways of working around responding quickly in an emergency and operating more as in a kind of command and control environment that perhaps some of us are used to, or certainly some of us would like to be working in. But nonetheless, the intention is that we do all of our work based on user research. We test things with real people. We measure with data and with ethnographic research, and we use that kind of learning and sharing in these kind of 2 weekly cycles of activity to improve, to learn, and to I guess keep each other kind of honest with the work. So now we're through this massive deadline of Unitary. We're able to be a bit more reflective. We had a great retrospective. We talked a bit about, not least, how we're perhaps not as agile as we would like to be, and had some ideas about how we can make life easier for our teams as we go forward. And importantly, started to think about some of those other big ticket items we'd like to move on to now that we've got through this particularly big hurdle. So the job has always been to build this new website and all the things that go with it. So content management system, design systems, content strategy, all the kind of technical infrastructure that underpins it, and to give residents a really clear and easy way to find things, to find information, to find services that they need, and that initially through lots of signposting, because we'll have lots of old legacy websites with us still for quite a while, which meant in adding a new website to the mix, we needed to make sure we didn't make things any more confusing perhaps than it already was, and ideally to kind of improve people's experience of finding information. So over the last 2 weeks, so since the last show and tell, we've done some of the things we said we would do, which is good. We've been looking at some of the coronavirus information that went up incredibly quickly. So we broke some of our own rules around content creation, around how we write for the web, around how we design things, around how we test things. Quite a stressful time for me particularly, because I was trying to hold these things quite dear, and we had to do things in a slightly different way. But we've now got a bit of breathing space, so obviously the crisis isn't over, but the initial kind of glut of information that we had to get published for people is done and there, and we're now learning how effective that is for people, and we can see some space to make some improvements, to improve the information architecture, to simplify some of the content, and to just make it a bit simpler for people to get access to the really important information they need about getting support, getting help, and importantly offering support and help as well. So we've got some ways for people who do have time or capacity, perhaps businesses who have staff who can help to tell us about that and to explain the way they can do that. Always looking at homepage and navigation, lots of work kind of wrapping up some of the stuff on jobs, and that's ongoing. Lawrence will talk a little bit about some of the things we've been doing there, and catching some of the corners of the rebranding exercise across lots of our old websites and kind of web-based platforms that either didn't get rebranded in quite the way we expected, or something unexpected happened that we needed to go back and make some amendments to. And finishing up some of the work with colleagues on the contacts and complaints service as well, which is something we got live for vesting day, but there were a couple of bits of that that just needed to be kind of tidied up around the edges. And we're also going to talk you through quickly some of the things we're thinking about for the future. These aren't all necessarily completely nailed down or necessarily going to happen in the next kind of few weeks, but it's stuff we know we need to think about and start getting onto the roadmap. I told you children would join the party. And we might need to do some kind of technical and design spikes, so some deeper dives into looking at these. So things around policy and strategy documents, forms. We have lots of ways of doing forms, information about different council assets, so things like libraries, office locations, school closures, something we use a lot in the winter, so it probably makes sense to do some work on it in the summer. Things like open data, data visualization, blogs, press releases, events. So you can see there's a lot there. That's certainly not stuff we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks. That's a good kind of 6 to 9 months worth of activity there probably, but that's stuff we're trying to get kind of roadmapped out at the moment. So technical debt, what is it and why are we reducing it now? Who am I handing over to?
I think it's me. So if you can click to the next slide, hopefully you can hear me okay. I realise that I probably look like I'm staring off in the distance, but I'm just looking at my second monitor, so apologise for the setup. So yeah, technical debt. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the stuff that Jobs has been doing in relation to some of the technical debt. So some of the things we've been doing the last sprint. So obviously we launched the service, the site on the 1st of April. In the last sprint, we've been adding a few more features and also going back over the features that have already been built and making sure they're as consistent as possible. So a lot of this has been going through all of the different components that have been created and generated for the different features, the different things that users will be kind of going through, application forms, etc., and making sure they're as consistent as possible in the front end code. A number of reasons why they might be inconsistent. That could be because they've been implemented in different ways, different people have been working on them, or have different kind of use cases. But now it's kind of going back, making sure that the styling is correct, sort of a global styling, using the design system that we've created in Zero Height. So Zero Height's a bit of software where we've got all of the different components in it. And that picture in the top right, you can see there is, for example, a button, and all of the correct kind of attributes is on the right. So just making sure that everything is consistent, not just the buttons, but other components. So it's kind of, it's tidying up essentially, but it takes some time. So what else have we been doing? We've been doing cross-browser checking, making sure it works on lots of different types of browsers that are supported. So using something, probably Browser Stack, to make sure that this experience will be consistent across different platforms, and then also making sure that the layout of the pages is consistent as well. So all of the pages are different; they've got different components on them, but making sure there is some consistency across all of them. So, for example, the headers should be consistent. We've added breadcrumbs which are in line with how GovUK do breadcrumbs. So these are things that kind of maybe got missed out in terms of the first pass version of the site, but now we're kind of going back and making sure everything is as watertight as possible. So, for example, the breadcrumbs, it allows users to get back to where they were before. Yeah, I think that's everything for that slide. Click. Cool. Yeah, and so in addition to doing some of these more kind of general global kind of technical debt pieces, we've also been working on some additional features. So as I said, the job site launched on the 1st of April. That was a fully functioning site. It allowed a user to search through the jobs that are in the system, see the details of those jobs, do some basic filtering, and then apply for a job. So everything a user needs to be able to apply for a job. But now we've been enhancing that by adding some additional features. And a good example of that is the filtering is now almost ready to be released. And that includes lots of different ways that a user might be able to narrow down their job search. So looking at more kind of detailed job categories, the types of contract and working hours and salary ranges, and then a location filtering functionality. So you put in your postcode, and then all of the results that match your search will be able to go in order of closest to the postcode as possible. So that's an example of a smaller improvement, which is quite useful. Certainly in user research and user testing that we did, that proved a useful component that people were asking for. And that's something we've been working on since the launch date. So there'll be a number of other features, including kind of fleshing out the job advert pages a bit more, adding some logos and things. Maybe not super essential, but definitely things that have been asked for and been clear that there's a user need for. So these will be things that we'll be working on in the next sprint. I think that's it for my slides. Thanks.
That would probably be my part. So that's part of one of the new work streams already, and you know, something we are already starting to look at. I mean, you can probably click and go to the next slide. So this is basically about designing pages that are a little bit more complex. So typically, these would have been in the past documents that may have been uploaded as PDFs. So those would be you know, the kind of documents like policies or strategy documents, even parts of the Constitution that needs to be kind of published in a more accessible way. And as part of the well, one of the key goals of putting this new website together is just making sure that all the content is accessible in you know, more easily accessible in all the ways possible. So that may include publishing some longer form content as HTML pages rather than a link document, but also making sure that you know, when we do that, it's published in a way that it works with screen readers and all sorts of like alternative devices, as well as when we upload documents such as PDFs. When they are uploaded, it's useful if they're published in such a way that they are working with screen readers, for example. So what we've been doing in that respect, we've been looking at some existing guidance, for example, by Gov.uk, or we've been looking at some of the work that's been done in other councils in that respect. So there's an example from the Brighton and Hove Council on the top that actually has a few different components on the page that we are currently on our website we're not able to display. So there's like an additional navigation that kind of goes through the different sections of a long document. There may be different ways of presenting data in those documents. So you can see like there's a really big number there. We may look into presenting some graphs as well and things like that. So we don't know exactly where this is going to lead us yet, but we know that we need some more things in place before we can properly do that. Going to the next slide. So as a starting point for all this, we started talking to some people within Buckinghamshire Council. So we started talking to the policy team, and we were aiming to generally talk to anyone that's involved in creating policy documents or strategy documents. And we really want to understand what the needs are of the people that are producing those documents and publishing them, what they need in order to do so in a way that would better suit the kind of presentation on the website, right? So how do you write for the web in a better way? How do you write in a more clear and concise language, etc. At the same time, we also want to do some research with people that actually read those documents to understand, you know, what is currently working or not working well for them. We understand that a part of that work might be actually looking at that end-to-end journey and producing some guidance in order to produce those documents better. So one of the quotes that's on there is just coming from one of those early discussions, was that, you know, one of the biggest challenge is giving people the right skills to write in a way that is suitable for publishing in HTML. And that's it regarding this for now.
Thanks, Lawrence and Boris. So yeah, and that last point that Boris was making actually is a really important one, not just in the work we're doing with the website, but when we look across kind of how services are designed and some of the other ways that people interact with them. You know, some of the letters that local councils send out, yeah, certainly some of the things I've received from my local council as a resident are baffling, frankly. You know, they're written in a very specific way, in a language probably that the officer writing it understands, and it's probably legally, absolutely spot on. but not always the simplest thing to interpret and act on. So, I think some of the things we would learn as we explore how to help people write well for the web could apply actually across other bits of the service design kind of process, and could help us improve a whole range of things. And even internal documents as well. The number of reports I've had to read at various transformation boards that are impenetrable and about 20 pages longer than they need to be. There are things I think we could do by bringing some of these content design kind of principles into a much broader spectrum of work. Next few slides from me. These are things, kind of other emerging work streams, not really in any particular priority order at the moment. This is something we need to work through and decide what's going to bring the most value to users before we kind of commit to any work on these. But the things that are kind of top of mind that we know we need to look at as potentially new kind of features on the platform, or improving features we already have. So firstly, I have no idea where I've stolen this quote from. It's scribbled down on a bit of paper somewhere. Government is mostly forms most of the time, which is probably truer of central government than it is of local government. Particularly if you kind of look around at the kind of thing that's happening now in response to the coronavirus crisis. Actually, local government is almost mostly not about forms right now. It's about very kind of in-person support. It's about getting food to people. But in normal times, a lot of the ways we ask our residents to interact with us, to apply for things, to report things, to pay for things, happen through forms. Traditionally, those were paper forms that you might have taken to an office or into a post office. But obviously, it is the 21st century. These forms now live on the web, and importantly, live on your smartphone. So it's something we need to do better at, and to get right. And it's more complicated than it first seems, I think. So I was going to share a few different ways we're doing it at the moment. So we have some simple forms. These are things that live within our content management system. Generally speaking, they're kind of single page forms, quite simple, kind of capturing data, not using any real validation, just simple stuff to just capture some really basic information, and then probably just that gets sent off to an email inbox somewhere, a shared inbox, or it goes into effectively a database that you can extract a CSV from. Beneficial. We found it helpful in our kind of emergency response. We could very quickly get some simple application forms up. So they're quick to build, and thanks to all the work that colleagues have done on designing a good, robust design system, they're consistent, they work well, they're accessible, all these good things, but they don't scale brilliantly. And I say that as a person who's finding themselves having to manage kind of where data goes and who does what with it. That's fine for a few records on infrequently used forms, but as you start getting into kind of thousands of responses to things, having such a clunky kind of data management approach is less than ideal. So those would probably be used quite rarely, and for things that are perhaps not of massive importance. What we've got next, so the terminology is probably not quite right, but I've called them complex forms. An example of that is the complaint about a service, and also some of the stuff that Lawrence showed on jobs. Multi-page forms, kind of one thing per page style forms, integrated with back office technology. So, a form response will be sent over an API into some workflow system that a team uses as part of their kind of day-to-day process. It may also be able to kind of retrieve information from those systems as well and present them to users as part of these forms processes. Much more complex, scale really well. Obviously, if that's going straight into a workflow system, then that fits with how teams want to manage that data and want to manage those processes. But they're relatively expensive to build. Each one of these is going to have its own kind of nuances, its own APIs to get to grips with, to do the integration with, to set up the kind of the testing, and to make sure that we've got kind of error reporting and everything else you need against things like this, so that we know that it's consistently doing what we expect it to do. And with the sheer number of forms that local authorities have, I think at last count it was somewhere north of 400 different digital forms of one sort or another. Running kind of custom builds, custom integrations for all of those is going to get pretty expensive pretty quickly. So this is something we need to be quite thoughtful about. When is the right time? Actually, when do we really get the value from doing that level of integration and that level of relatively custom or kind of bespoke work? The next thing we've got, oh, my GIF didn't load, that's a shame. This is one of our low-code platforms. We have more than one. Obviously, we've had a few councils have kind of merged together to create the new Buckinghamshire Council. And these are kind of highly configurable. They're quite good at building quite complex workflows in a relatively simple way. With a few days training, somebody who has a good business analyst head on them can pull together quite complicated processes. It can include things like validation. It can include things like your various admin rights over databases. You can do, to some degree, integrations with different bits of technology as well. But you have a lot less control over some of the design, typically, and how some of the interactions work. Your forms package is kind of the forms package, so you may not be able to do styling, in a way that is completely consistent with your design guide. Some of the accessibility we found certainly on some of our older forms packages are not necessarily quite up to scratch. And yeah, you just have some constraints over things like analytics and other bits and pieces. So as great as they are for doing things quickly, they come with some other costs as well. And so we've got a range of all of these. We've got different forms being used in different circumstances for different things. And what we think we need to do is to get a bit of a strategy around this, really. Where are the bounds of these different types of forms? In what circumstances should we be using which ones? And with the low code stuff, because we've got more than one platform at the moment, we probably need to have a think about which, if we're going to use some low code technology, what is the right one for this new council, and how do we kind of govern and manage that properly so that we're able to build really good digital services for people. Or there might be some other options we haven't thought about. There's a whole world of kind of extensions that have been built on the Wagtail platform that we're using that we probably need to have a look at, go and investigate and see, have other people built some really smart things that might solve for some of the problems that we've got in front of us. So yeah, so forms I would expect to continue to be a thing we think about and do a fairly detailed piece of work on quite soon. So something else that's on my mind at the moment is how we hold information about the different assets the organisation has, the services that you can access from those different assets, and their kind of current status. So an example of that would be we have a number of council office buildings. Those office buildings have a name, they have an address, they typically will have a contact telephone number, and they'll have a range of services that you can access from that location, so things you can do or get, and those services will be open at different times, and they will some might be kind of free at the point of access, some might be paid for, some you might need to be referred into, etc., etc., etc. So there's quite a complex data model behind not just the asset location, but the things you can do there. The thing in the background, the kind of overly detailed diagram that you probably can't see very well, there's a separate project that a few colleagues in MHCLG have been working on, which is looking at something called open referral, which is a standard around services type data. So there are ways that are defined, some data standards that are defined about how you can hold information about things like services and the places that you can access those services. So something we would like to think about is what's a good way of looking after this data so that it's potentially reusable, and so that we can perhaps do things like changing the status of a particular asset. So if a building is open or closed, as a simple example, because of for the kind of current corona crisis is one version of it, but buildings quite often have to close for different reasons. You might have a water pipe burst, the heating might fail. There are things like that do happen pretty much every year for a lot of organizations, that might make it you need to change the status of that building. So having a way to do that simply and in a way that's described, so that it can be indexed and potentially served over an API, I think is something we would like to look at and explore. Can't remember if I've got a different slide on it, but I'll say school closures now. So it's the summer now, and schools are actually, spring, and schools are closed again for a different reason. But typically in the winter, we have school closures happening at one time or another because of adverse weather, and we have a system in our old website that deals with that. And we know we will need a new one of those. So that's something that's kind of on our list to look at. It's in this realm, but it's very specific to schools being able to set their status to open or closed because of snow or ice. Boris mentioned visualizing data. The little animation that's playing there is the coronavirus dashboard on Gov.uk, which was published a couple of days ago, I think. And I've seen some similar work that I think colleagues at the ONS have done before, with just really nice, simple interactions, being able to turn a table of data into a chart, having that render nicely on a small mobile screen. Nothing crazy, simple line charts, simple column charts are pretty much all you need for most data most of the time. And being able to kind of link to that data and have it downloaded. So something we're thinking about in the context of those policy pages and reports. It feels like a nice to have feature, but I'm quite keen that we're able to give colleagues in the organisation some more helpful ways of displaying this kind of data in a format that is still accessible. Otherwise, what we tend to end up with is PDF documents or images that are difficult to describe and difficult to manage. Anything we can do to get out ahead of some of that demand, I think, is probably a wise investment of time. Related to that is open data. We have a duty as a public sector organisation to publish data about certain things. So our spend over 500, our senior management structure, our kind of most senior people's pay. These kind of things as mandated. We have to do it. There's also a ton of data we hold as a public organisation that has value outside of our walls as well. That it's good practice to share. Some organisations do a great job of this, so kind of nod to the Data Mill North and folks up in Leeds who've been blazing a bit of a trail on this for quite a while. There are established ways of cataloguing open data, of describing the licenses around, how people can use and reuse that data, making sure it's published in an open standards-based format so that people can reuse it simply, having things like persistent URIs so that they can always find the right data and not break links to it when they're using it for other things. So tons to think about. Again, at its simplest, it's just well structured CSV files published on a website is enough. But there are some other things we could do potentially to add a bit of value around the open data space that, again, I think we need to explore and have a think about, look at where the value might be before we place any particular bets on how we might do that. Events. So we have an event system, but we're not using it. But we know it's a very basic event system right now. So the council and organisations the council works with and things like our library service run lots and lots of events through the year. We want a way to help residents find those events. It's at its simplest, it's a listing, but we know it needs to be more complex than that. So some of our events will have, they'll be recurring. So, they'll happen every Thursday. Some of them will be recurring with exceptions. So it's every Thursday except for, bank holidays. Some will have bookings. Some will have bookings for places, some for people, some for other things. So there's quite a lot of complexity that could exist within an event system, particularly if you start looking at bookings and payments for things as well. So again, this is a thing we need to look at, think about, and size appropriately. We need to look at which bits of our services need some of these capabilities and what is sensible for us to explore and build, and what actually it can be done with other bits of technology. Where might something like Eventbrite or another booking service be the right option for things? That's the kind of stuff we want to get into and have a think about with events. And again, because we're not currently doing any events, it probably is a good time to have a think about it, so that we can explore and build without having to also run an event service at the same time. So I think that's kind of it, but probably not all of the things. We know we've got some bits of work we're doing around accessibility. We've mentioned that a few times in the context of some of the other things here, but we have some work we're doing with the Shore Trust in June. They're going to help us do a bit of an audit and have some of their users work their way through the website and try a few different user journeys and see how they get on, give us some both some kind of technical feedback in terms of an audit, but also some contextual information from real users who've tried to do things on the site. So we'll be able to use that to make some improvements across the platform and our content. Colleagues, certainly colleagues who've been working on the kind of front end of the website are looking at some of the improvements we know we can make now and kind of getting those done as soon as they can. And the new website should hit the SOCTIM, so the Society of, I think it's Chief IT Managers or something similar. They do an index, so it's a kind of local government index index of how accessible the council's corporate websites are. So it's quite an important, quite visible kind of benchmark or league table of how well people are doing on things. So, you know, organisationally, kind of small p, politically, it's important that we do as well as we can on that. So we should hit that index in May. That will give us a good sense of where we're at and where we can make some improvements as well. So next things we're looking at. Where are we? We've talked about this before, but as we're coming into May, we're very much in the kind of improving things, fixing technical debt, fixing the things that we rushed as we move towards our deadline, getting some of our practices, you know, a bit more like they should be. So we're doing some work internally to get better at planning and estimation, and making sure that we're picking up on some of the user research side of things as well. Trying to get ourselves back into a slightly more agile mode where we can. So yeah, fixing technical debt, loads of content. We've still got tons of content, so much content on our old websites, and colleagues in the content team are having to think about where do we have things that we can move now, where we can do that rationalization, we can rewrite, redesign, get it published and start switching some pages off on some of our old websites. And actually where is that content kind of, you know, tied into a much bigger service that is perhaps just about to go through a form of change or transformation. We might need to think about that slightly differently, and phase that differently as new bits of technology are kind of explored, new services are designed. All our old websites still need managing. You know, the content still needs to be accurate, it still needs to be right, all the old forms and processes still need to work. There are still teams operating, running those, as well as trying to help kind of move this new project on. So that's still happening in the background. I've mentioned some of the things that we might need to start some technical discoveries on. And we really need to get focused again on how we do our user research well as a remote team. Again, it's an area we've probably not done as much as we should have, so we need to get some processes back in place to have a bit more of a robust approach. Sorry, there's a bit of chit chat in the background. And then, yeah, on to the next show and tell. So next show and tell will be in a couple of weeks' time. I hope you can join us. We'll try and get better at getting these live streamed events kind of easier to join and start. But yeah, unless I've missed anything, colleagues, I think that's probably everything. Sorry, we can't do questions. Email me any question you've got, ben.unsworth@buckinghamshire.gov.uk. Drop me a line if you want to have a chat about any of this. Otherwise, we'll say goodbye. Cool, we're done.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Make sure, stop streaming.